Hey, Quad Culture. I'm Caleb Unger. Hopefully, you already know that. And with us today to talk a little bit of women's March Madness, maybe the best March Madness, is Caitlynn Bell. Caitlin, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Yeah, doing pretty good. Ready to talk about this, that's for sure.
So I don't know if they can see, but you're repping your Huskies a little bit. How are you doing?
True.
They were close. They were so close.
Yeah, game just got over today. It was rough, but they pulled the usual. They failed in the fourth quarter. It's fine, a little salty, but they at least were able to contend for March Madness again, first time
Yeah,
since like 2017. So,
there you go.
first step down.
The glory days, Kelsey Plum, and we'll
Oh
we'll
yeah,
talk we'll talk about her later, I'm sure.
true.
So before we get into it, or as we get into it, tell me a little bit. Give me one team that you're really looking at that you're like, this is a guaranteed contender right now in this March Madness. If you had to pick one
Hmm.
right now.
See, one would have to be UConn right now because they were able to win their conference championship as we all predicted. They won by 20, easy win, but they were one of the few teams out of like the number 1 and 2 teams that came out with like a win at the
Mhm.
end of their season, and so they're coming in hot, and they also have a lot to bring. A lot of talk about Paige Beckers and her wanting to get to at least a championship game in her college career.
Yeah.
But like close behind them would definitely be South Carolina, also coming off a win, and just the depth and all the amazing talent that they have on their team.
Yeah, so when you look at this like UConn team, right? Paige is such a huge aspect. Top pick probably in the WNBA draft. She comes from this long lineage of really great UConn guards, but I mean, can she really be in it if she doesn't have that championship, which so many UConners have? I guess when you look at their side of the bracket, do you think them having to be in that same area as USC is going to hurt them? That they're going to have a little bit more of a tough path to get to that championship, whereas like UCLA has a little bit of an easier ride with the two seed being NC State.
True. USC will definitely be their biggest contender. I mean, they played each other early back in November, and UConn only lost by 2. So if they end up meeting USC, according to their rankings going into this, they're going to come in with a lot of heat and fire, and I think they'll be able to change their game, especially matching up against Juju Watkins. I've watched a lot of USC games this year, and the teams that have able to like break down Juju and like play a good like 2-on-1 on her, but also be able to guard the inside is where they've been able to break them down and be able to like bring in a game, but also like get a win because they do have a few losses. And so I think UConn is one of the few teams that will be able to do that against them. And I think USC is probably more scared than UConn is going into that
Yeah.
matchup.
So as we kind of look at that, right? I think this year it's really interesting when you look at like the bracketing. I think partially if you're like a TV fan, you got to be so mad that you're
Oh
getting
yeah.
Paige and Juju in the Elite Eight rather than in a sort of Final Four, that type of matchup. Two
Yeah.
biggest stars in college basketball, probably the two biggest names. The one side that I want to talk to you that I'm really interested in is Texas is a one seed. TCU is a two seed. You got Notre Dame on that, as well as Tennessee. So you have all of these really established women's basketball sort of powerhouses, at least this year. So for me, that leads into my pick. I'm big on TCU. I like the way Haley
Oh,
Van Lith runs this
huge.
offense. We're going to talk about Sedona Prince, the basketball player, which is somebody who can get buckets pretty frequently. So you have that post presence as well as that guard presence. So when you look at that cluster of teams, TCU, Texas, Notre Dame, and Tennessee, who do you think finds their way through that? Because when I looked at the bracket, that part stood out that like wow, that is a good cluster of
Agreed.
teams.
Hmm. I personally have been watching Notre Dame for the past 3 years well, 4 years since Olivia Miles was a freshman. And there's a core group there. You have Olivia Miles, Citron, and Westfeld that are the three core, all seniors. And then they had
Hmm.
a senior transfer come in, as well as Hannah Hidalgo, who's now a sophomore. She's got a year of experience on her.
Hmm.
She's first team. And I think the 5 of them will be able to bring more than any other team in that side of the bracket. You have TCU. Yes, you have Sedona Prince. and Haley Van Lith, who have been able to like make this TCU team. But you have to remember that like TCU didn't even have a team last
Yeah.
year, and they've been able to build from the ground up, which is awesome and such an accomplishment. But I honestly think that even though Notre Dame has had those like weird fluke losses this year,
Hmm.
that they're gonna come in with a drive that like, okay, we're seniors now and this is like our last chance to like make a mark in March Madness. And so they're gonna bring a lot more drive than maybe like TCU would bring, although you have Haley and Sedona who are also grad students and like this is their also last year.
Super
But I think like
seniors.
the depth, yeah, super seniors, oh my gosh, so many. But I think the like depth of Notre Dame against the TCU matchup, you're just gonna see the experience level come out more in that game and see Notre Dame take the win. But then Notre Dame has Texas, and Texas is an interesting team. I love watching them play,
Yeah.
and they are such a fun group and definitely developed great defense, but they're lacking in their offensive end because they just can't get things done. You've seen them play South Carolina now 3 times this year, and they got destroyed 2 of those games.
Yeah.
They just didn't look good in the second half, and it was horrible and terrible way to go out. But they also have Madison Booker, who is fantastic, so fun to watch. And I just think that the developed team of Notre Dame will be able to like rise on top in that situation because Notre Dame's defense is so intense and like you have Hannah Dalago, who I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure averages like at least a few steals a game. It's got to be
Hmm.
like 3 or 4. It's insane. And so I think they're just going to break down the Texas offense really fast.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I was kind of looking at some of that stuff, and obviously TCU kind of drew me just because I always like that. When you have your big person down low, your post, and then you have a really good guard who can get the ball. But I get when you look at that matchup, right? That potential Notre Dame, TCU matchup, which I think could be a really good game. Do you
Yeah.
think a big concern if you're TCU, you look back at that game that they lost to Iowa last year for LSU, where Caitlin Clark just shredded Haley Van Lith? So is the defense and the size of Haley Van Lith a concern? Putting her in switches, getting her on taller scorers, is that a worry if you're TCU as you go into this tournament?
Probably not on their side of the bracket until they face
Hmm.
Texas.
Okay.
Because Notre Dame, you're probably going to have the Haley Van Lith and either Olivia Miles or Hannah Doggo. She'll probably be matched up on Hannah, though, because I don't think anyone else on TCU can handle her.
Yeah.
And so, like, size-wise, that's not going to be an issue for the Notre Dame game. It's going to be the rest of the guards on the team, on the
Yeah.
TCU team, matched up against the rest of the Notre Dame guards. You have Citron, who's also 6 feet tall, and I actually don't know the height of a lot of the TCU girls, but like I was thinking about this earlier, like if you come in as my UW girls going against like a Texas team, like UW is not as big sized, even though they're really skilled, they just don't have the size matchup. And so
Mhm.
that's what I'm worried about with TCU.
And last year, kind of, it seemed like that South Carolina team was undeniable, right? Even as Caitlin Clark kind of propelled herself, won some big games
Mm-hmm.
down the stretch, much to my chagrin, as you remember, beat
Oh
UConn,
yeah.
took over a lot of teams, took out a lot of teams. But it kind of seemed like once they got to that final, it was that idea that it was just too strong of a South Carolina team. It was too deep, especially against an Iowa team, that had really good role players. But when South Carolina has, 7 of the 10 best players, it's hard to win that
Yeah.
matchup. And so South Carolina, though, has not been that team this year. So do you think this is a year that potentially we could see South Carolina go out in the Final Four or lose a championship? Or do you think this South Carolina team is just as undeniable as they have been in years past?
See, if you talk to Dawn Staley, she would say the other thing. She'd be like, we have been underrated this whole season.
Yeah.
I think that they are definitely like a top 5, 4 team. It's just that they have a few losses under their belt, which have been odd for them. Like that
Yeah.
doesn't happen for South Carolina. So then why is that? Why do you have like a UCLA and USC team who are just as good according to their record as South Carolina? And so I think that's where a lot of people are doubting that.
Yeah.
But also they do have a really good freshman. They have a sophomore guard, Malia Fawiley, and Chloe Kitts, senior now, junior. And I think they still have pretty good depth, more than people give them credit for. And I know a lot of people are putting them out in the Elite Eight or even like the Final Four, but I honestly
Mhm.
think they're still going to make it to the championship. It just really depends on who they're matched up against in the championship. But before that, if they get to the Final Four and have to play Texas, I I worry about that because it's really hard to beat a team 3 times. They beat them
Yeah.
twice in the regular season, lost to them once. That's pretty normal. That happened with USC. USC lost against UCLA in the Big Ten championship game, but really hard to beat a team 3 times.
Yeah.
So I think if they're matched up against Texas again, they'll have a good chance. But bringing in Notre Dame and also like the developed team that they are, if Notre Dame makes it that far, that's a potential run into. But if they go past that and make it into the championship game, I think no matter who you face on that side, UCLA, UConn, or USC, you're gonna have a pretty good matchup.
Yeah. So to kind of wrap up this side of the conversation, gut feeling, who you picking to be in your championship game?
Championship game, I have South Carolina and UConn,
Okay.
which is very unlike me because representing the Pac-12, I would love to see UCLA and USC in that Final Four matchup, but I'm going with UConn this year.
Yeah, I think a lot of my thoughts when looking at that UConn USC matchup was I think a lot of what you kind of opened with was just that idea that, Paige probably has this extra motivation to get to that championship game, whereas we already know Juju Watkins is coming back. And so,
Mm,
not to say that she's not going to go hard and try to win that game, but there's that little bit extra when you know that that's potentially the last time you ever wear a UConn uniform.
true. Yeah. It'll be interesting.
So let's pivot a little bit now to the WNBA. Obviously, that'll kind of start up this summer. So a lot of the interesting conversation around the WNBA last year obviously revolved around Caitlin Clark, and for good reason. Had a huge effect. If you went to a Caitlin Clark game, you saw her presence, you saw the jerseys, those types of things. Over the winter and just post WNBA season, the conversation just got even nastier, which I don't know how it could have. Um, how do you think the WNBA as a whole needs to pivot? Because as somebody who has been critical of Caitlin Clark, sometimes her on floor presence, as much as I can criticize that, and sometimes I think her attitude, and sometimes on the court, off the court, she carries herself better than almost anybody that I've seen with her level of fame. So, how do you think the WNBA can do a better job of really supporting their LeBron James, their Michael Jordan, their person that's going to bring people to games and help grow the sport? What do you think the WNBA can do better?
I think it'll just depend on like this next class too, because you're going to have a lot of presence in bringing Paige Beckers into the league,
Hmm.
and it'll really depend on how they respond to her because
Yeah.
if they're able to give her opportunities of viewership and like her team viewership, like they did the Indiana Fever, then it's gonna continue to make like the impact good instead of negative.
Hmm.
But also, I haven't seen a lot of actually the kind of critics on Caitlin Clark. I've tried to avoid that
Yeah.
honestly because I really want to see how she just brings it into the game this season.
Yeah.
And so if that sophomore season, if she's going to be just as hot as she was, but also like they have a new coach, you're going to bring in some different players on the Fever. And so if she can basically have more support around her on her own team, then that's going to make her more developed as a player and be able to grow in her own game and I think prove herself in a way. And I don't think she was able to do that with the Fever. And that's just the unfortunate thing of being the last
Yeah.
or the first draft pick
Yeah.
going to the worst team. And it happens, but it all depends on how you respond. I think she's responded well. It's just, I don't know if the WNBA was ready for the amount of presence she actually had or knew the capacity that it would bring.
Yeah, and so I think it's interesting because now we're looking at a WNBA, obviously, that's moving towards expansion. But right now, this is the deepest the league has ever been. So, whether that's Angel Reese, Caitlin Clark, Asia Wilson, Cameron Brink, Sabrina Ionescu, and Brianna Stewart, you're looking at players that have huge social media presence, that have huge followings, even a Jewel Lloyd going to the Aces. These are players that are really, really popular, right? Even I think more so than the Diana Taurasi's of the world and the Brittany Griners and those types of players. Like even more so than anything, it's a lot of that social media presence. Do you think that this league is primed to really start picking up now that there's more and more depth in this league, especially with the Paige Beckers coming in, who's also a really popular player?
Yeah, I think it's going to bring a lot more. You have Cameron Brink, who's coming back this year after being injured, which was very unfortunate. But I think with the expansion and like the location of the expansions, that's going to be really beneficial to bringing more people to the
Yeah.
WNBA and watching. But also, it's just going to make players a lot happier being able to have more people on the roster because there just wasn't a lot of opportunity overseas even,
Hmm.
and a lot of people just don't come back because they'll play overseas for a while and then realize that's not worth it because they're not making any money.
Yeah.
And you don't make a lot of money in the WNBA either, but at least they're doing something and continuing to grow the league. And I think with all these new, not new, but like college players coming into the WNBA and having that presence will just continue to build their just everyone's knowledge of the WNBA and maybe watch more.
Yeah, hopefully. And so past
Hopefully.
that conversation, I mean, I think sometimes the WNBA conversation can get bogged down with like ratings and you know what is Caitlin Clark doing for the game and those types of things. I know you more than anything like to talk about the game. So when you look at the game and you look at these teams, who are some teams that you think are basically championship contenders when you look at the WNBA?
Yeah. Well, you had your two teams last year. New York Liberty ended up winning it all, and then the Minnesota Lynx were the runner-up,
Mhm.
and their rosters really didn't change over the season. And so they're going to bring the same intensity that they brought this year, and the Minnesota Lynx, they won a championship. They made that 5-game series competitive, and they did not back down. It was probably some of the most exciting games I've watched in a
Yeah,
long time. They were amazing. It's just so fun to watch such developed players like play to their full capacity. It's nuts. It's so different than college. I don't know how else to explain it, but
yeah,
college is another vibe. So fun to watch. But I also think that, or at least it's probably a hope, that I hope the Seattle Storm actually make it in the runnings
yeah,
because last year was such a disappointment. It was, oh my gosh, we have some hype behind us. We have a good trio, and we could probably make it far and at least compete in the playoffs. And then it just failed. But I also think you're going to have the Aces come back this year. I
hmm,
mean, they have Jewel Lloyd, and Kelsey Plum kind of had a weird year. It was not her best year, but I
yeah,
think going to the Sparks will actually be good for her. Maybe get a change of scenery, but also work with some different players, which would be a great opportunity for her. But bringing in Jewel Lloyd to the Aces, I think will just bring that same dynamic and fire that they had a couple years ago to win a championship. So they're going to be really good contenders too. And there was one more team. Oh, the Fever, of course. We have to talk about them because they got some good players. They got Sophie Cunningham from the Phoenix Mercury, underrated player right there.
yeah,
And they also have Dewana Bonner from the Sun, and she is probably one of the most developed small forwards in the league right now. And for her to be with Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston, who now is a couple years in the league, and you put Sophie Cunningham in there, I think that gives you a really solid five. I'm not sure what the depth is going to look like on a team,
yeah.
but after the draft, we might figure that out. But they're going to be a really fun team to watch too.
See, so this is the part where I'd love to be a homer. If you watch the other podcasts, you know I love my Washington Wizards. I'm actively rooting for them to lose so that we can get Cooper Flag. The WNBA draft already set. I'm a Mystics
Yep.
fan. Hasn't been a great offseason for us. Owner making
Nope.
comments. Just overall, not a great looking team. I love Aaliyah Edwards. I think she's great. It sounds like we might just be going to Notre Dame guards right off the bat, and so that's pretty exciting because I mean, you spoke so highly of them. I'm so excited to get them
Yeah.
now. But I think in a lot of ways, I look at the Sparks, right? We talked a little bit about my love of having a good guard and a good big. I think Cameron Brink coming back. I think what was really underrated when she went down last year was just how good she was defensively. Her ability to, obviously, she has really good length, so her ability to get blocks to affect shots when people go to the rim, I think, is huge. But I'd be remiss if I didn't. even talk about the Fever. I mean, Caitlin Clark, so dynamic. I mean, can make a shot from almost anywhere. Really improves the offense all around her. I think last year there was a lot of frustration probably on her end because I think she was creating a lot of opportunities that weren't being capitalized on. But now you look at an Aaliyah Boston with those additions in free agency. I think that team is just so much better. And it was a team that really looked like it was on fire near the end of the year. Obviously, the Lynx are a part of it. The interesting thing that I wanted to touch base with you before we leave is I think the Aces are going to be a little bit better than they were last year. Jewel Lloyd, really good scorer. Becky Hammond, obviously top flight coach out there. I'd be a little bit worried if I were the Aces because the Spurs might be giving her a look if Popovich decides to step away. But with the Liberty, you know me. I'm a Brianna Stewart truther, lover.
True.
She looked a little old at times, which I mean, I think she's been playing for quite a while now. Obviously a big body, that plays physical basketball. And so is there any part of that that you factor into the Liberty potentially that, she comes off of the unrivaled season, a lot of miles are being put on Brianna Stewart now. Do you worry about that at all for the Liberty?
Honestly, I haven't.
Okay.
I think she's still got a good amount of time in her. Even though, yeah, she might seem a little more agile. Like we saw that with Diana Taurasi last year, and we were like,
Yeah.
okay, when are you gonna retire? Like,
Yeah.
I think it's time. But I think she might be on the downslope, but she's still hanging in there. And until she
Mhm.
has like a weird off year or like weird half season in her career, I think that's when she'll actually consider it. But for now, like she's one of the co-founders of Unrivaled, and
Yeah.
so I think she's going to stay in the league for a few years longer just to continue the Unrivaled season and making sure that continues to develop and grow.
Yeah, and hopefully as Sabrina Ionescu can sort of start to take on more, their offensive load will sort of switch with Sabrina Ionescu taking on more of that. Also just a really solid team overall. Caitlin, thank you so much for coming on today. Always love to talk
Yeah.
women's basketball with you. I always learn something. I this time though, I if you want to know anything about the past relationship of me and Caitlin on basketball, I was big on dogging on Caitlin Clark last year, and I can't tell you
Same.
how many times Caitlin Bell put me in my place and proved me wrong. So
What can I say?
I
I
would.
really try.
So if you're making your picks, maybe don't listen to the guy who's rolling with TCU. Maybe I'm right. Who knows? But I would be way more inclined to trust Caitlin. But Caitlin, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
All right, have a good one.
You too.